Harry, Arlin, you were in Ferramonti in the what you it's
camp.
not a camp. I would call it. It's not a concentration camp.
They called it the literal Italian phrase.
But they seem so able to
Concentramento.
freely move about and do their lives. So I wouldn't call it a concentration camp. What would you call it?
Well, it was a concentration camp. We were refugees in Yugoslavia, originally from Czechoslovakia. And we happened to be lucky that we were in the Italian occupied portion of Yugoslavia. So they arrested us and put us on a train. And I mind you, it was not a cattle freight train like the Nazis used. It was a regular coach, a regular train. They put us on the train, and we arrived a day later in Ferramonti. We expected the worst. You know, we heard about concentration camps already then. And in 1941, we arrived, and we thought we had to go through a check-in, but they didn't take our possessions. They didn't take our clothes. They didn't take our money. They didn't take anything. They just were looking for weapons or contraband. So we settled, and they didn't split the families. So we settled in a camp, and we tried to do the best we could. I mean, conditions were not very, very good, but nobody was tortured. Nobody was killed. They pretty much let the people in the camp run their own show. I just have to tell you a little thing that we did have a clinic. We didn't have a school. We had a synagogue. We had a church. The clinic was an interesting place. They had an Italian doctor who was in charge of the clinic. But there were so many Jewish doctors who were detainees that the Italian doctor simply stepped aside and let the Jewish doctor do whatever was necessary. Well, it so happens that my father had a medical condition that the clinic was not equipped for. So what did the Italians do? They called for an ambulance, took my father 30 miles to Cosenza, to the provincial capital, put him in a hospital, and they allowed me to go to visit him. I mean, that's the concentration camp that nobody has heard of. It was a place by Nazi standard, you could call it a resort, but it wasn't that good. We used to go swimming. It was very hot there. We used to go swimming. We were crawled under the barbed wire to go to the river outside of the camp, and then we had to go back under the barbed wire to get back into the camp. The Italians were guarding us, but we didn't have machine gun towers or anything of that sort. It was, what can I tell you, a life. Well, we were lucky because we were in the south of Italy. We were liberated in 1943 by the British 8th Army. So I enlisted in the British Army, and that's another story. I won't talk about that.
What do you think, Harold, it is about the Italians?
I'm sorry?
What do you think it was about the Italians that was different from other groups? The Polish were not as nice, for example, and they were Catholic. They were not as good to the Jews.
No.
The Hungarians were not. The French weren't either. So what about the Italians? Why?
I don't know. And I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry. I'm hard of hearing.
You said, what was it about the Italians that made them different?
Brothers.
The Italians were humane. I can't describe to you how humane they were because the Germans were not.
That we know.
Definitely not.
Well, 80% of the Jews in Italy survived, whereas 80% of the Jews in Europe died, and 80% of the Jews in Italy survived.
In Ferramonti, we all survived.
Yeah.
The only violent death that we had in Ferramonti was from a Royal Air Force fighter plane that strafed the camp. And 4 people died, and I think about 8 or so were wounded. And they set 2 barracks on fire. But everybody in the camp survived. There were a few people who died in the camp of natural causes, and they are buried in the Catholic cemetery in the village of Tarsia, which is the closest town. And I think that's the only Catholic cemetery that has Jewish graves. I think there are about 4 graves there left at this point.
And also, Harold, didn't you become friends with the sons of the director of the camp? Did you become friends with that?
Oh yeah, the director of the camp had 2 sons, and they became friends. And since they were not detainees, they would take me out on trips out of the camp. We roamed all over the countryside, and they were just wonderful people. The camp director, or the commandant, if you want to call it, had a horse, and they didn't show it in the film, but one of the people in the picture, Charlotte Hauptmann, was a little girl, and the commandant put her on a horse, and he rode the horse around the camp. He also had a car, and he would sometimes take little kids, put them in a car, drive them into the nearby town in Tarsia, and buy them ice cream. I mean, if that isn't humane, I don't know what else could be.
Okay.